Madam Moderator, welcome, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, thank you. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you to our debate today. Thank you for joining us. Our debate is titled Should Africa's Climate Declarations Be Made Legally Binding for All Who Sign Them? Well, the debate today is hosted by Africa Youth Climate Finance Fellows, which is a powerhouse group of young leaders from across the continent who are stepping up to understand and tackle to break barriers to shape options. Well, this debate comes at the right time as the second Africa Climate Summit. Kindly mute yourself. Thank you, everyone. So you'll have an hour and a half. Well, this debate comes at the right time as the second Africa Climate Summit is happening later this year. And today's debate interrogates whether the Africa Climate Summit truly delivers on its promise to amplify African agency, mobilize finance, and reshape global climate governance from an African perspective. In this debate, we're challenging the fellows to interrogate the power and limitations of non-binding climate declarations and agreements, as well as to examine the feasibility, enforceability, and justice dimensions of transforming the Africa Climate Summit from a symbolic convening into a legally enforceable instrument that binds both African states as well as external actors, particularly those that make pledges for climate finance, technology transfer, or loss and damage. Without further ado, let's dive right in. But before we welcome our debaters, let's also think through these questions. Can Africa afford another decade of climate promises without accountability? The stakes are rising. Should the Africa Climate Summit move beyond symbolic declarations to legal instruments with teeth, obligating action, tracking progress, and enforcing commitments? And lastly, should African nations and international pledge makers be legally accountable for their climate promises and actions? Well, let's find out together from our debaters today. We have two teams of fellows that are prepared to argue for or against legally binding declarations. I am Monica Mhina, your African Youth Climate Finance Fellow from Tanzania, and I'll be your moderator for today's debate. We have three debaters for the motion, who are Tinaya Mabara from Zimbabwe, Jonas Henry from Ghana, and Valentine Tenge from Kenya. And we also have three debaters against the motion, who are Noru Harris from Liberia, Elbethel Alamel from Ethiopia, and Andile Kumalo from Eswatini. I would like to welcome them to introduce themselves and give us their opening statement, starting with debaters for the motion. Please welcome Tinaya.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you to everyone who has joined today. My name is Tinaya Mabara. I am an AYCF fellow and a climate education facilitator. So I want to start by stating a simple truth in my opening statement today, that we as Africa are owed climate reparations. We have not contributed historically to climate change, and yet we bear the brunt of its impact. The overarching goal of legally binding climate declarations is that they will legally bind the biggest polluters to pay more climate finance. They will compel our own governments to transparency and accountability for our shared goals within the continent that are linked to our ability to adapt and build resilience. Let's look at a developed country that stays headlining for the wrong reasons lately. One of the biggest polluters, if I might add. The US has become synonymous with unsigning and leaving treaties and agreements. They left the Paris Agreement, thereby leaving all the other commitments along with it. Many countries in Africa are impacted by these decisions. We are at risk today, now more than ever, to food insecurity driven by droughts and The change of a leader in a developed country was able to upend our lives, causing major disruptions to the lives of many Africans, including those that are offering relief to the most affected communities. We need legally binding declarations that can stand the test of time, protect against political cycles, and build donor and investment confidence, therefore fostering our shared accountability here in Africa. We are at a crossroads, and for decades we've watched non-binding climate pledges gather dust, empty promises and commitments. Today we know that Africa cannot afford another decade of declarations without teeth. Thank you.
Thank you, Tinaye. Over to you, Jonas from Ghana.
Everybody. Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Yes, good. I also believe that, yes, indeed, Africa's climate goals should be made legally binding. This is solely to ensure accountability and facilitate effective actions, thereby by enshrining climate targets in national law. Countries can establish clear enforceable obligations, attract investment, and foster a more robust legal framework for climate action. We see that most of the political parties in the various sub-Saharan, African countries only come to power for at least, 4 to 8 years. These climate goals are goals that should go beyond at least a decade, because they have to include heavy investment into infrastructure that at least, its lifespan will be 30 to 45 years. So therefore, a clear lack of political policy incoherence is not going to do Africa, any good. But the whole of Africa is literally only committing to at least, I think, some about 3% of global greenhouse gas, emissions, whilst, the far advanced countries in China, Europe, and America contribute well over, 60%. But they have developed their countries to, to a further extent. So I think it's really about time we make them, legally enforceable, and also just to enhance, governance, because we also realize that most of the people who suffer from climate change is women and children.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I'd like to make this brief submission.
Thank you so much, Jonas. And now I would like to welcome Valentine.
Thank you, Monica. My name is Valentine Tenge from Kenya. I'm an African Youth Climate Finance Fellow, and I'm also in the investment banking industry in Kenya. I'm here to support the motion based on my most recent fundraising experience, and I'm supporting the motion that Africa needs more legally binding agreements to deliver accountability, enforcement, and equity. And this comes from the fact that we already have precedents that we can build on and mirror, and binding legal obligations give Africa the opportunity to, one, mandate transparent reporting and independent review. I think one thing we know about climate and climate finance projects is that there is very limited data and there is very limited accountability in terms of what we are doing on ground. Legally binding obligations would guarantee differentiated treatment for least development members through explicit treaty carve-outs, ensuring that equity and, the populations that are disproportionately affected are, there's a legal obligation, just as there's a legal obligation to, provide funding to African nations because we contribute to the least amount of emissions. The second reason why I think we really need legally binding commitments, based on my most recent fundraising experience, again, is for capital flows to come into Africa, there are very high legal costs and fragmented fund registration regimes that often deter Pan-African capital flows. So if we can have a legal framework that allows capital flows to flow through Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, without, cross-currency issues and all that, then we can have more harmonized domicile rules like having an African Union marketing passports that allows any investor, coming into Africa or willing to invest into other areas to navigate all these trade, domicile issues and all that. So I'm here to support the motion that we need more legally binding treaties to invite more serious investors into the conversation.
Thank you, Valentine. Very compelling points from the debaters for the motion. Now, I would like to invite debaters against the motion to introduce themselves and give us their opening statement, starting with Noru. Welcome, Noru.
Thank you so much, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noel Kolu Harris, and I'm an Africa Climate Finance Fellow. And today I stand before you against this motion that Africa should be made, African countries should be made legally bounding for all of us who signed them. Ladies and gentlemen, and fellow debaters, I stand before you to strongly oppose the motion that African climate declaration should be made legally binding. Why? Someone may ask. This is because legally banning declaration risks more harm than good. Africa doesn't need a rigid contract. It needs cooperation that adapts, includes, and empowers. Look at our history. From the Malabo Declaration to the Maputo Protocol, legal commitments have often failed, not because of a lack of laws, but because of a lack of systems, resources, and willpower, which make declarations legally binding, who also discourage participation from countries and partners. It could threaten national sovereignty and replace ambition with anxiety. We want participation strives on trust and not threats. Thank you.
Thank you, Noru. Now I would like to welcome Elbethel.
Honorable moderator, esteemed colleagues, my name is Elbethel, an Africa Youth Climate Finance Fellow from Ethiopia. As a pharmaceutical professional, climate and health advocate, and founder of Green Health Africa, I've seen how empty promises hurt vulnerable communities. Today, we're told that binding declarations will solve Africa's climate crisis, but this is a dangerous illusion. There are three irrefutable truths that we cannot ignore, and these come with evidence. The first one is sovereignty risks. The AU's Malabo Declaration demanded 10% of budgets for agriculture, and only 9 of 54 nations have complied. If we cannot enforce food security, how can we enforce climate rules? And the second one is diplomatic suicide. If we demand lawsuits, the global north will walk away, just as the US abandoned the Paris Agreement. And we cannot ignore grassroots betrayal. Binding terms would crush local solutions like Kenya's community solar projects, while youth groups like Fridays for Future already hold leaders accountable without rigid laws. And let me just elaborate that we're not against accountability. We're against systems that have failed Africa. We want truly implementable solutions and evidence-based approach. Things that have been proved to work. And real power lies in people, not paperwork. And we should reject this false solution and fight for justice that actually works. Thank you.
Thank you, Elbethel. Over to you, Andile.
Thank you. My name is Andile Kumalo from the Kingdom of Eswatini. I am an AYCFF fellow. And I'm here to debate against the motion that says climate declarations should be legally binding for countries who signed them or parties who signed them. This is a very bad step towards achieving the same goal, which is increasing climate finance. Africa's climate progress is stalled by isn't stalled by the lack of ambition, but it's sabotaged by the unenforceable legally binding agreements. While binding agreements like the Paris Agreement fell short, or the Paris Agreement's $100 billion pledge fell short by $17 billion. Transparency, on the other hand, transparency delivered results, like the Nigeria recovered $2.4 billion in oil royalties through public audits, no courts, and just accountability. We have to also look at the case where like Kenya's open renewable energy auction attracted $5.6 billion, while binding regional agreements have failed. Again, another example, Botswana cut solar cost to 0.026 kilowatts per hour, which is the lowest in Africa, by the way, by simply live streaming tenders and exposing corruption. The choice is clear: empty treaties or open books. Binding declarations become paper tigers, like the AU's Great Green Wall, with just 18% of its funding delivered. But transparency, data, public data, audits, ranking, force actionable action without infringing sovereignty. Because we have to understand we are dealing with countries, and also we have to understand that we are dealing with private investors, of which they want to see the transparency and the accountability before they even put their money wherever they want they're going to put it in. So we really have to understand that there are better ways. We want to reach the same goal, which is the increase of climate finance, but there is a better way of doing it: transparency and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Andile, and the debaters against the motion. Wow. Both sides have compelling points for and against the motion. Now, I would like to hand it over to the debaters for the motion to state their points and explain them further. Welcome.
Thank you, Monica. So to expand on this, we need legally binding climate declarations for enforced accountability and long-term sustainability. We talk about the US leaving the Paris Agreement. This was the legally binding document that they declaration that they have left, and there will be consequences. Just because it's unfolding in 2025 and so much is happening, it doesn't mean that there are no consequences. They have lost trust in the international community. And I invite my opponents to also look at the fact that even though we are referencing the Paris Agreement like it's not legally binding, it is. And the US wasn't even the biggest contributor to climate finance. I invite you to answer this question. Without the Paris Agreement, because it's a legally binding document, do you really believe that all these countries that are contributing to climate finance would be doing it out of goodwill?
Very good question, Tinaya. Andile?
About the US leaving the Paris Agreement, and you said there are going to be consequences. We don't have that time. The climate, we need climate finance now, as in yesterday, because it's really deteriorating. The situation on the ground isn't looking pretty. We need to find other ways to deal with this. Like I said before, these binding agreements are unenforceable. Who's going to take the USA to court? With what resources? How much is going to be spent there? How much time is going to be spent there? And to your question, it is really unfortunate that you're putting it. These countries have the moral obligation. The only thing for us to do is just give them that edge in order to give us this climate finance. And how we're going to get to that point is to be an open book. Be accountable, show transparency, and then, because you better understand, the Paris Agreement was done for transparency and accountability. But why do we need a third party to take care or to show that to other countries that yes, Africa is safe to invest or to finance or to give this climate finance? Why don't we, as countries, as a continent, show that on our own by being an open book and sharing our data and accounts? Why don't we do that on our own? Why do we need a third party? A question back to you.
Thank you, Andile. So yes, I would like to invite you to see that legal enforceability is not a threat for Africa. It's liberation. It is the only recourse that we have towards our global north countries that have been issuing empty promises time and time and again. Binding agreements will transform the Africa Climate Summit from its symbolic stage where it currently is into a credible engine of accountability. We need to move to the next stage. And for me, I clearly see that we need legal frameworks for compliance science. And these are frameworks that are already working within the continent. We have legal frameworks set up by South Africa, such as the Carbon Tax of 2019. We have Kenya's Climate Change Act, and so many other countries are following suit by setting up climate change acts. These are legally binding documents that have been ratified nationally. And if we bring these to the African Union and we hold the rest of the world accountable, we will finally get climate finance that addresses the things that we need to address in Africa, which is resilience and adaptation. We will not get this by simply asking nicely, because we have been working with developed countries, but that hasn't really resulted in much.
Thank you,
Just a quick
Tinai.
question.
Over to you, Noru. Let's hear from
I
Noru and
think-
we'll come back to you, Andile.
I just listened to Tanaya, and I think the question should be who the US has signed, considering the legal implications in the first place. Now, let us talk about real world practicality, right? Africa does not have a regional court to punish countries, foreign or domestic, for breaking these climate promises. Even if declarations were legally binding, how would we enforce them? No enforcement mechanism, no jurisdiction over foreign donors, no uniform capacity across countries. And let's not forget, only 8 of 43 countries achieved their targets under the Malabo Declaration, considering it's a legally binding instrument. Legal frameworks did not stop that failure. Why? Because the issue isn't a lack of rules, it's a lack of resources, technical capacity, and support. And I also like to say laws without infrastructure are promises without power. Now let's talk about innovation. We all know that innovation needs freedom and not fear. Let's shift our focus a little bit. Voluntary declaration may not be binding, but they allow for something even more powerful, like what we call innovation. They give countries and opportunities and local communities the opportunity to freedom to experiment, adapt, and scale up their works best for them. Whether it's community-based adaptation, agroecology, or off-grid solar, flexibility fuels these progress. And let's be clear, banning rules do not empower grassroots actors. They often concentrate on decision-making in government hands, and they push local voices to the sidelines. If we truly want inclusive climate leadership, we must make space, not mandates.
Thank you. Let's get Hello? Okay.
A bit crack in the internet. Can I continue?
Yes, you can. Go ahead.
So our debate is mainly centered on the Africa Climate Summit, the Africa Climate Summit, and the Africa Climate Summit's strength lies in uniting diverse actors. And legal rigidity could fracture consensus, especially for smaller states, which are vulnerable. And the examples that have been mentioned by the proposition team are relatively stronger nations from the African 54 countries that we have. And the legal teeth will not bite the global north, but they'll definitely choke Africa's partnerships. And as has been said by Norwu, Africa lacks continental courts that can sanction non-compliant state or external actors. Even the Paris Agreement's binding terms rely on peer pressure, not penalties. And the International Court of Justice has no climate mandate, and the AU Court of Justice remains inactive. And we should focus on what we have now, because we're discussing on the Africa Climate Summit 2025. And without enforcement, binding declarations are performative. It's like locking a door with no wall. And African nations must retain flexibility to prioritize domestic needs over rigid continental mandates. Legalizing climate pledges could conflict with national laws or economic priorities.
Thank you, Elbethel, and the team against the motion for reminding us that we do not have a compliance mechanism for legally binding commitments. Now let's hear from the debaters for the motion.
Thank
Welcome.
you, Monica. So I think one thing we need to be very clear about is that let's get off this punishment bandwagon. No one's coming to punish anyone. We don't really need to have like, solid, I do understand the need of having like strong, maybe legal bases and all that. But what we're trying to argue for is that when you put ink on paper, can we have consequences for not meeting that commitment? And I'd like to give an example of, I think, what happened recently with the African Development Bank, which I think I think the Kenyan government close to 100 million Kenyan shillings or something. It was a substantial amount for not meeting a certain health target, which was tied to, I think, completing a hospital or something. So when we think of legally binding commitments, what ideally we're thinking of is minimizing the policy drift or the regulatory risk that comes with, how political entities tend to blow hot and cold. And if you are in the industry, I'm sure you saw the effect of the US pulling out of, the effect of USAID, the cut in foreign aid cuts. People lacked jobs, people had to go back home and all that. So we have real impact on ground, over and above, the debt issues that Africa has, that, this back and forth by, foreign countries and foreign investors causes on ground. So to avoid regulatory backsliding or missed targets, I think the best way to go and the best way to avoid especially discounting of Africa's capital markets, because things like taxonomies and carbon border measures become more credible only when they are underpinned by enforceable law. And I think we've seen things like the Paris Agreement. I think the EU has now moved beyond the Paris Agreement to something called Fit for 55. So hoping to reduce their emissions by 55%. And all of this, including the US Inflation Reduction Act, all these have only worked because they paired legal mandates with calibrated incentives. The second is legally binding commitments allow us to, ideally, the human mind, whenever you put something as, legal or mandatory, then unfortunately you're able to get more results. And I think this is what we really need in the climate industry in terms of what are you emitting? What's the process you're using to calculate your emissions? Otherwise, when we leave it to, Kenya comes and they says we'll reduce our emissions by 32%. Another country comes and we don't have any legal basis or any procedural footing to, sit down and validate the reporting, sit down and validate the numbers and all that. So I think let's not look at legally binding as something that punishes Africa. I think that's what Africa really needs now. We've been on pledges since, I think, the things like the Kyoto Protocol, they go as far back as, I think, 1987. That's over 30 years we've been on pledges and all that. So can we try something new without thinking of legal as something that puts us in a box, but instead that something that protects not only the projects on ground, so that projects don't stall because one country decided that this is not a priority. What we want ideally is, once you come into the commitment, how do we know that you're serious? We know that you've signed a paper and you put ink on paper because there's a consequence down the line.
Thank you, Valentine. Debaters against the motion are ready. Let's start with Andile.
Thank you, Monica. Just to bring to your attention that these legally binding pledges could threaten sovereignty of countries. Like countries' sovereignty has to be protected by any cost, either locally or internationally. We have to acknowledge that no country wants to put themselves in a place of disadvantage, whereby they can't make choices by themselves. They are forced by papers. They are forced by courts. It's a very big threat to a country's sovereignty. When you mentioned the USA, the USA with the US aid cuts, there are other forms of finances that we are still receiving from the USA. What if we step on the bad toes? What if we're stepping on their toes? This could be a step of that could make them completely cut Africa as a whole, or even change their the finances that we desperately need at the time, like some health finances we need, and change them to climate finance, because now they're going to be forced to provide the climate finance because the courts are going to enforce it, and they're going to be taken to court if they don't. They are funds that like these countries, these big polluters, we're getting a lot of finance from them. We're getting a lot of business from them. We shouldn't forget that these countries are still our biggest buyers. We trade with them. They're the biggest market. They're our biggest market. We have to understand that. When the politics this is a bad political step. It's a bad political step to take, because it will tarnish the political relations we have built through trust, through tabling issues and talking through challenges that we face. So this is really a very risky step to take. The accountability. There is Kenya's renewable energy boom. It's a feed-in tariff with independent monitoring. It attracted $5.6 billion in private investments, while the East Africa community emission targets were ignored. Some countries are going to choose to ignore this, and it's going to take a lot more money than they contribute as individuals or as countries, than to go to courts and sue them on this, and the time is going to take. The litigation is time consuming, and it's resource consuming. We don't have the time and we don't have the resources. Let's focus on what we have. We have the power of transparency.
Thank you.
We have the power of accountability. Thank you.
Thank you, Andile. Now let's hear from Tinaya and then Elbethel.
Andile, I would like to remind you yet again that developing countries owe us climate reparations. They are not the hand that feeds us. They owe us money. They contributed to climate change as we know it, and therefore they must pay for us to adapt. They need to pay. It's a debt that we are owed. We do not bite the hand that feeds us when they owe us money. So when someone owes you money, you don't show up to their doorstep and ask nicely. You create systems, you create legally binding agreements with these people so that they can give you back the money that they owe you, so that you can fix your house using their money. We are not dealing with them on equal footing because they have not made good on the pledges that they've made, recognizing that they are historically responsible. So please bear in mind that we are owed money by these people. They are not the hand that feeds us. We can only be on equal footing with them once they pay back what they owe in the form of climate finance. And also, I just wanted to address this thing of fear. I think that we move with a lot of fear that maybe if we bite the hand that feeds us, maybe we won't do so well. A majority that Africa can actually be self-sovereign, but we will not be able to do that from a place of fear. We can not negotiate on equal par with developing countries if we are still afraid of living without them.
A quick response to tonight. We are saying we need the finance. These people, they are the ones who choose to sign and not sign. Nobody can force them to sign. Even if you get them, how are you going to get them to sign the legally binding ones? They're the ones, at the end of the day, they decide. Why don't we come as partners, as equals to them, and table what we have, the systems, the framework that are already there, already working, and say, we are going to offer you this, you offer us that, as equals, as partners. When is Africa going to start and stand up and stand on its own 2 feet and say, I'm going to be transparent, I'm going to be accountable, and just doing that, we will get this funding. We still have a huge corruption problem on the ground where there's greenwashing with the climate funds. So it's really on our side. We need to clean up house before we even go to this international investors and local investors even. We need to clean up house and make sure we are squeaky clean, so these people, they can see from a mile away that their money is going to be used in the right way, not in the wrong ways. As I pointed out, there's greenwashing, which is a situation that's happening on the ground. Hope that answers.
I did like to just make a quick follow-up on the greenwashing point that Andile just made. I mean, let's take green climate policies and laws, just like how we have our legal laws over here to protect women and children against domestic violence, etc. let's take our green laws as any one of these infrastructure, policies that any country has. Okay, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, South Africa, etc. Okay, I don't think that any one of these policies and laws are perfect in nature. You know, I'm sure in our respective countries we'll still find a few couple of judges who are corrupt, but it doesn't mean that we should put on hold, the trial of people who are found guilty of domestic abuse against women and children. It doesn't mean that so far as, let's say, a few couple of the police are corrupt on the road, we should not go ahead to prosecute, road crimes. That's not the basis. So I did like to stand on, on the principle of you don't need a system to be perfect before you go and, let's say, enforce policy in countering what Andile just made. There's no need to seek perfection over here, even to an extent. Okay, the countries that we look up to in terms of their justice systems, and even in terms of development, they still have quite a substantial amount of corruption also under their belt. It doesn't restrict development. We don't need to have a perfect system before we go ahead to put in place certain measures to
We're not
hinder
saying
and to
that
stop.
we need a perfect system, but our system is very young. We still have a lot to go. For example, the AfCFTA trade agreement still stands at 3%. That was signed in 2021, but many countries are still behind. This proves that Africa's systems are not ready, and there is a huge gap between the growth of different African countries. Ethiopia or South Africa and Sierra Leone or others might not be the same. So we need to understand and we need to acknowledge that there is difference, and we need to work on our internal unity before we say that these declarations can be binding. We're not saying we're striving for perfection. We are not, but we should acknowledge that there's a gap. There's a difference. We're trying to unite diverse actors. So we need to, that's the point we're trying to make. And we also need to understand that investors avoid legally risky pledges, and only small percentage of climate finance is coming from private sources in Africa. And Africa is not ready for this. We need to build strong partnerships, and we should not ignore Africa's biggest resource, which is the youth. And we have amazing work that's being done, advocacy work that's being done in different countries in Africa. And we're already, including ourselves here, we're doing amazing work towards tackling climate change. So we need to work more on Africa's leadership, and true leadership means rejecting false solutions. And AU's own Court of Justice hasn't ruled a case since 2020. And how do you think it's going to enforce climate fines? We do not have a system for that.
Thank you, Alberta. Just to add on that.
Andile, let's hear from Valentine in Norway, and then we'll get back to you before we jump and get questions from our audience. Thank you.
Yeah, I think the narrative that the whole point of climate financing in Africa has been that Africa has the chance to leapfrog. So leapfrogging means we have all these lessons from the Paris Agreement to all Kigali Amendment and all that. We have all this as a basis for us to try and learn and leapfrog, which means saying that we are not, we are very young to have. I think this is the right time to actually bring in the legal conversation, so that if we are going to avoid all the mistakes that the developed world has made in terms of their climate ambitions, then we are very lucky, I think, to be at that nascent stage and still be able to nip the problem in the bud, if that's how I can put it. In terms of our current situation in Africa, I think without we're already in a worse off situation, given that we have very high public debt. So ideally, we're not expecting anything from our governments outside of meeting, our debt repayments and all that. So unfortunately, the only direction we can look is private investors. And I'd like to disagree with Albertel that investors actually, any legal standing is like, if you want to attract investors, then show them that you have a legal standing, you have, a legal framework that can, protect them. So from my experience in fundraising, high legal costs are a leading reason of why developing fund managers are unable to raise, because you find that one, before you bring a foreign investor on board onto a fund, they'll want to not, you could have a Kenyan firm with you, a Kenyan legal firm, but then you need to have either a UK based or a US based, other legal firm to sort of back it up. So if we can have all these at the beginning and at a very national level to sort of like a boilerplate language to say that if money comes into Africa, this is how it's handled, this is how let's say finance linked compliance. Andile spoke about green hashing. So for Africa ourselves, if we are not able to meet that, what do we also have to incur legally for not meeting that, either through green hashing, greenwashing, and whatnot?
Thank you, Valentine. Noru, and then we'll go to questions.
Thank you so much, Monica. So I heard the opposing team talking about accountability and enforcement. While enforceability is key to ensuring accountability, the current voluntary structures that we have has helped build momentum, trust, and learning opportunities, especially for African countries with the limited historical responsibility for these emissions that we're talking about. And going forward, I think combining the voluntary pledges made at the ACS with stronger tracking and incentives systems could also offer the best of both worlds, both the ambitions and accountability. Now, I want us to talk a bit about precedents and enforcement, right? There are a lot of other models that have been in place that we can learn from. And one I heard the opposing team talking about the Paris Agreement not being legally binding and having people withdraw. But despite the fact that the Paris Agreement is not legally binding in terms of emission targets, but the strengths have been transparency framework. Countries are reporting on emissions and their progress, right? And every 5 years, there's global stock take being taken to kind of track what has been achieved. And also there's the name and shame pressure that comes from the public and reporting and also diplomacy. And also the NDC, the Nationally Determined Contribution, provides flexibility that allows these countries to adapt to the goals and the local conditions. Now let's talk a bit about the African and the regional models.
Thank you, Noru. So sorry to cut you off, but we really need to move and answer some questions. I know the team against the motion still has some points to raise. We'll have our closing statements. Please prepare your points for then. We have 2 hands, so we'll take those 2 questions and answer them, and then we'll have another round. I would like to welcome Mahrous. Please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. You're welcome to ask your question to the fellows.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity. I will first want to thank all the panelists for this wonderful presentation. Also, I have a very small question, but for me it is very big. So we had Africa last year, I think 2 years ago, and we were
Hello? I think we have lost Mr. Mahrous. Maybe let's go back to someone called iPhone. Please. Hello, you are muted.
Yes,
I am. Go ahead.
Can you hear me now? Thank you very much. I'm sorry, the displayed name isn't clear. My name is Jean Zinda from a consulting firm in a climate finance in Kigali. Right now, I'm talking from Quebec, where I'm attending a business, health, and climate meeting. Thank you for the debaters. I would like to agree with the 2 sides, but with the 2 different perspectives with this question. I first of all agree that we should have legally binding agreements, but that should be between African countries, not to just put it at a global level, because none of the legally binding international agreement has ever acted in the interest of Africa. You know that. Let's take an example of this very recent Paris Agreement that has brought in place the Green Climate Fund as a financial mechanism that still has some restrictions that really limit African countries to access the climate finance, but also the pledges never fulfilled. We have that very big gap and no one is suing them, yet it's legally binding. Now, coming to the side of project investors who really bring those emission reduction projects in Africa, but we lack the legally binding, I would say, policy and the legal instruments in place that really force them to make sure that the investment is in country, is in Africa. You will see that even carbon market transactions are happening outside Africa. So we don't even benefit it. So from one side, I support that Africa should have legally binding agreements and instruments, but to serve the interests of African countries. On the other side, I don't support having a legally binding agreements between Africa and the rest of the world because it doesn't benefit us. Now, the debaters, well, how can African countries frame those legally binding, I would say, agreement tools that really benefits African countries? That's my question. Thank you very much for the audience and the debaters.
Thank you so much for that question. Let's start with Elbertha. You're on mute?
So first, okay. So first, I want to point out that legal uncertainty usually scares capital, and binding rules will create unpredictable regulatory environment. Most investors rank that regulatory hurdles can be a top concern in emerging markets. And why would companies commit billions if rules can change overnight? And there's also fear of lawsuits, which makes high-risk climate projects uninsurable. And there's different evidences that we can use to support this. And Africa's renewable energy projects already face 2.5 times higher insurance costs than the global average. And sovereign states may override contracts to comply with new rules. And African public-private partnerships face regulatory risks. And today's binding pledges can become tomorrow's broken contracts.
Thank you, Elberthel. Quick to Andile and Valentine, and then we'll take another question.
Thank you, Monica. It's a very insightful perspective from and a question from the audience there. The question is, what do African countries or what can we use that like? I'll come back to a point that's really I'll put it in plain words. We have systems that work on a national scale. The only thing we need to do is put them on a continental state and then in a global state. We have systems that work: transparency, accountability, putting your data out there for investors, not only for international investors, but for even private investors. It has worked before and it will continue working. The only thing, let's focus all our resources in towards this initiative or this framework, because it really works. It has a very transparent or reliable trade record. We have seen it working before. The only step to take is to make it continental and international. Let's make this because we really have to use working systems. Don't start something that will backfire and will have problems, because every system will have problems. This system has problems, but they're already solved. We are halfway there. Now we just have to focus all our resources and all our brain power and use what we have as Africa to make it continental or at a global stage. Thank you.
I think I'd like to chip in, and I think the question asked, the person was he was sitting on the fence, do we or do we not move on with legally binding agreements and all that. But I think what is clear is that what's clear is that we have the opportunity to look at what the developed world has done and tailor it to Africa's needs. I think within the Africa Youth Climate Finance Fellowship, we recently had a very heated debate on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And my argument at that point was, if the Africa Continental, trade agreement is, still in the development stages, can we then identify what are Africa's strengths? What industries do we really thrive in? What do we export, and what proportion of these exports have high carbon emissions embedded in the products we produce? And then from that way, we can then be able to again leapfrog what the developed world failed at. So let's not look at the pledges and bash them and say they didn't work and so they're not going to work in Africa. I think we have a very unique opportunity to look at, how the developed world has handled the Paris Agreement to date and localize it to African tests. And I think one thing we also argued about was we need to clean up our own backyard as the African continent for us to then invite the foreign world to come in. So as much as we're arguing that, this legally binding conversation, one, invites African countries to look at ourselves internally, identify what's our competitive advantage, and then go up with a united front to the developed world and say, we are no longer going to take resource-based lending. I think Ghana recently declined there was something that Ghana did, I think, swapping one of their resources for something else, and I think it's something that has come, to a halt or something. So I think when we look at it internally from one, let's organize our house internally and decide how do we want to handle our legal framework? Do we want to have different currencies? The AU is actively trying to have a uniform, potentially, unified currency platform for Africa to go to the rest of the world, with one currency. So if we can start from that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Valentine. And sorry to cut you off. Time is not on our side, but I see Nicholas, Otieno, Melchizedek, they're all in agreement with you that we need to have systems that are for African by Africans. Would like to take one more question from the audience, if any. And if not, I'm happy to invite our fellows for their closing statements. And I'm seeing points on the chat. I think there was a question about bad politics. So what about the bad politics that sometimes lies behind these legally binding declarations? It's like climate politics is largely influenced by these signings. Anyone wants to chime in on that? Please welcome.
I'll just agree with it. Firstly, it is the most important point I think that the viewer has brought up. We have to consider the political stage. How are we going to play when we already have a handicap? When we already want to force these people into agreements that maybe they don't agree with? So we have to look at that. We have to be aware of such, because the world is run by politics. And we have to understand the politics. We have to work with it, not against it. Thank you for bringing up that.
I want to add to that and also just say, I don't think so, Andile. I think that at the end of the day, it's always going to be an issue of bad politics within this that are embedded in the legally binding agreements if they're not coming from us as Africa. So everyone in the chat is right. We need to actually band together. We need to use platforms like the African Climate Summit to actually lay the groundwork to come up with our own legally binding that are going to bind the rest of the world and not not necessarily us as a limiting factor. So we need these legally binding instruments to bind the rest of the world in order to actually set up a system that works for us, that serves us as Africa. As long as we are party to legally binding agreements by everyone else, we will never have a situation that favors us.
I got a question,
Thank you.
if I may, Awake.
Yes, go ahead, Owake.
All right, my name is Awake. I'm from Liberia. My question is still to both parties. Either one of them can answer. So we are talking about encouraging private investments in the climate space in Africa. What can we do to make sure that we put our private investor at ease when it comes to risks? What are those measures that you guys are recommending that we put in place to ensure that private investors get the return on their investments and get away with this whole Africa being a risky place to invest?
Okay, so I want to jump in here. So private having legal binding rules and having all these regulatory hurdles do not motivate private investment at all. There is data that supports that private investors will not be motivated to invest, and that is not something that we want. And there is a lot of work that's being done for climate action among different African countries, in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, all over Africa. There's amazing work that's being done. And this is without any treaties, without any rules. And we should prioritize partnerships, local action, civil society leadership that can facilitate partnerships and make it easy and friendly and welcoming. It will take many, many years and long time before the regulatory environment can adjust to the legally binding agreements that we are arguing against today. Thank you.
Just to add on that point, Alberto, thank you. Like, investors understand when they invest that they could either make a loss or a gain. So to put them at ease, why don't we put our accounts, why don't we make our accounts public so that they could track on them by themselves whether they are making a loss, or has the company been making profits, or has it been making losses? Is it a good company to work with? Is it what is their track record? Because investors have to know that they invest their money where they know that there is a potential of making a profit, because no investor wants to make a loss. Like, by doing this, by putting our accounts out there for the world to see and the investors also to see, they're at ease. They either know we're making a profit or it's a risk that we may lose the money we invest. So literally, it's just a simple thing to do. Put our accounts public and promote transparency, like Albert does.
Okay, let's hear from the team for the motion, and then we'll need to get to the next stage.
I think
Valentine.
to Awake would be the example I gave again, and I think I found the real number. It's the African Development Bank has fined Kenya 119 million shillings for delays in the construction of a kidney hospital, unfortunately exposing taxpayers to avoidable financial pain. So I think if we have such measures on board to ensure that we are not just punishing the developed world for not honoring their commitments, but we are also internally being responsible for when an investor comes in and we say, yeah, we have health problems and we have all these, the narrative that doesn't really put Kenya or Africa on the positive, narrative pathway. I think then we are able to avoid all this back and forth. So ideally, what we are arguing for is accountability on both sides. So if we can have the people, because ideally, why would we all travel to Ethiopia this September to just go and have very nice mouth-watering pledges and not have, consequences down the line? I think that's the only way forward. Pledges have not worked. The US is always blowing hot and cold on climate issues, and it's time for us to pin them down. Yeah.
I think we one more and end up from Monica, and we'll go after we answer this question. We'll go in minutes. Welcome, Wafika.
Okay, thank you for this rich debate, guys. I'm just wondering that since right now many of our countries struggle to access climate finance, even with the voluntary existing frameworks, don't you think that legally binding instruments can sideline those who can't meet those obligations? Not because we don't want to, but just because of systemic barriers. How do we prevent this legal accountability from becoming climate exclusion for us?
Rita, can I respond to that? Okay. So I would say, let's look at the impact. For example, the ACS that is legally binding. What has it achieved so far? We have seen encouraged broader participation and ambition from all of the countries, right? So the non-binding nature of many of these different climate pledges have made it politically easy for these countries, especially the developing nations like African nations, to be engaged in climate dialogues and be able to set these different goals. It has also increased visibility and voice in the global climate negotiations. And also it has bolstered the pledges that are being made, right? Such as the commitments to expand on the renewable energy, the reforestation, the green finance. These are some of the impacts. And we want to talk about how much it has facilitated innovations and collaborations, right? So do we want to withdraw on these achievements we have had so far? Let us take note that when we initiate these legally binding mechanism or instruments, countries are not going to commit, because at the end of the day, they're looking at the consequences, especially, for example, developing nations that are yet to even figure out or build their own internal capacity to respond to the climate crisis. Let us take those things into consideration. And one thing that we see, flexible targets. Once we set flexible targets that are tailored on national capacities, we're going to achieve it. And also these financial support mechanisms for these developing countries will also help us to be able to meet up with our commitment. In terms of transparency, I would say if we can put into place strong, transparent reporting and review systems, it will allow countries to be able to make up to their commitment around climate finance.
Thank you, Noru, for that response. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. We are almost done. We just need a few more minutes. Now, I would like to welcome the team for the motion to give us their closing statements, followed by the team against the motion. So let's start with Tinaye. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Monica. So in closing, I would like to thank Noru for explaining exactly why legally binding documents work, because they build the transparency needed. So all the transparency frameworks that we have come to benefit from and enjoy are as a result of legally binding agreements some way. Because they have clear targets, we need to be charting our way to some way. And for us, that is adaptation and resilience. We will not get there by prioritizing the comfort of pledge makers over the survival of millions. Legally binding climate laws are already thriving in Africa, from Kenya's Climate Change Act to the AFCFTA's Emerging Green Trade Networks frameworks. These initiatives not only reduce emissions, but also unlock opportunities for job creation and intra-Africa green trade. The next step is for us to deepen the integration of these climate goals through binding protocols and harmonized standards and cross-border investments at the Africa Climate Summit. So let's use the summit as a tool to actually operationalize legally binding climate agreements that put Africa first. Thank you.
So I think I'll go next. In my opinion, I think I've had the last 2 years on ground trying to raise money for a fund and, trying to speak to different investors in Europe and the US. And what I can tell you is that going to these summits and these conferences is very draining. One, you're meeting 10 people in a day or 20 people in a day, and if you're not going to have anything tangible out of it, then it's then, you've just checked a box and had a new network that doesn't have real impact on ground, and the sort of efforts you're trying to create in terms of climate finance. So I think the only way to have solid traction, to reduce all the brain drain that goes into one. I do know that we're here speaking about climate finance, but I've been in an environment where you're doing a lot of investor roadshows and you're meeting
I think we might have lost Valentine. Jonas, would you like to go next and we'll get back to her?
Yes, I'd like to go next until we get Valentine. I think one of the things that has really hindered the progress of Africa for a very long time, at least for the past 60 years, has been long-term investments. Investments that goes above and beyond 2 decades. One of the things we cannot underestimate and have to ignore in these times are the key foundations of our development, and that is energy. There's no way that we can talk about many industries. We can talk about even health infrastructure. We can talk about sustainable real estate without energy. It's not possible. So it's really about time we get committed first to the very principles that get to make up our energy infrastructure. Okay, and the first thing we have to look at is our carbon emissions, because we can actually go back to coal. There's a very huge, reserves of coal, for Africa, to go to, even in Ghana and Nigeria and so many other places. But I think we are not really exploring that investment of coal because of the carbon emission, the harmful carbon emission factor. Okay, so if you're having to rapidly move towards, rapid industrialization and also investment, it's really about time we get committed. Number one, making legal our climate investment goals, and having to make sure that we have a plan.
All right, who hasn't given their closing statements?
The opposing team. Vanessa, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Okay. So I would like to end by saying we don't need legal states. We need incentives, carrots, right? And how can we do this? Africa, I believe Africa can do this by ensuring participatory climate compacts with the grassroots inputs that is allowing indigenous people to participate and ensure their voices are heard. We can do this by community verification councils to be able to monitor our progress. We can do this by ensuring climate scorecards, showing performance of countries publicly. We can do this by recognition, funding, and trade advantages to be able to tap up those countries that are performing well. So incentive-based enforcement can really help us to meet our climate goals, but also the inclusion of trade or economic linkages will be able to add weight to our climate commitments. We believe that this approach is African-owned, inclusive, and achievable. It empowers all of our different African nations without punishing ambition, right? So legally binding declaration may look really strong on paper to the opposing team, but they risk weakening and the very things that Africa needs the most, that is unity, inclusion, and adaptability. So let us not lock ourselves into rigid systems, right? Let us lead with voluntary rigor, with creative flexibility, and the bottom-up accountability structures. With this, I would say Africa, let Africa lead with innovation and that application. Over.
Well
Okay.
done. Well done. Alberto?
So in conclusion, while our opponents cling to legal fantasies, we offer real solutions. The FCFTA example backfires because Africa's global trade participation still stands at less than 3%, which proves that legal text does not guarantee action. And despite the official commencement of the FCFTA agreement in 2021, Africa's global trade participation still stands at less than 3%. Which is really behind from the years that we have been trying to implement this framework. So sovereignty is not theoretical, and binding rules would paralyze urgent action in the context of climate finance. And diplomacy requires leverage. The global north owes $13 trillion in climate debt. And we're debating how Africa should be bound. This is a climate colonialism that is repackaged. And also the Africa Climate Summit is not to visit countries like the upcoming Ethiopia's Climate Finance Summit, but it's, as from the opposing team said, it's not to talk about mouth-watering declarations. It's to build partnerships and to discuss how we can bring Africa closer to frameworks that respect the sovereignty and the diverse systems that we have. And partnerships are built on trust. For example, Microsoft pledged millions of dollars to African climate tech startups to achieve more than any binding, and this achieves more than any binding declaration could ever achieve. Because real partnerships and real diplomacy unlocks doors that legal threats can slam shut. So the choice is clear between flexible partnerships that work and binding declarations that do not. And we should vote no to legal traps and yes to real African climate justice. Thank you.
Andile, please go ahead. And then Noru, it looks like you have one last thing to say.
So the law binds, which means both parties are going to be stuck together for a very long time, whether they changed, whether they are going against each other in political perspectives or whatever. They're stuck together by law, because we have to understand that both parties are going to be held to a certain standard, or going to be expected to bring something on the table when it comes to binding agreements. So when either party fails to cough up or meet up the agreements that they are made, they're going to be legal action and they're going to lose. It's going to take more money out of the African coffers. But sunlight, transparency, and accountability mobilize it. There's movement when there's transparency, when there's sunlight. When binding pledges become a graveyard of unmet promises, like the Green Climate Fund, Africa loses. But when Kenya's Chitemo data goes public, or Senegal's oil payments are tracked in real time, money flows and projects grow. Our power isn't in unenforceable clauses. It is the glare of accountability. You can't equate legally binding with effectiveness. Transparency delivers faster, cheaper, and more sovereign compatible results. We should ought to do that. We should ought to go the transparent route. We should ought to go the accountable route. Like we are currently pledged by corruption in Africa, which is also a proof of the lack of accountability and transparency, of which the African continent needs most out of everything else, because we are losing in the billions of in dollars by through corruption itself. So really, we have to reevaluate and really use these systems and improve our systems to meet up to this accountability and transparency standard. Thank you.
Thank you, Andile, and debaters against the motion and for the motion. Thank you all for your engagement. I think the key takeaways for me from the team for the motion is that effective agreements or treaties are usually legally binding. Why not climate agreements? And they would help reduce the regulatory risk and attract investors. And from the other side, against the motion, I've heard about the risk of loss of sovereignty and the need to push for transparency, as well as the lack of mechanisms to compel compliance, and which could have could deter partnerships among us. Very great points from both sides. I would like to encourage everyone to continue engaging in the comments as well as on our LinkedIn page, Africa Climate Ambassadors Program. There is no one answer fits all. It's a conversation. Let's continue to discuss. Would love to hear your thoughts, and please, in your own ways, in your own respective jobs and advocacies, continue to champion for strategic action to mobilize climate finance in Africa. We need it, and we really cannot afford to wait longer. It's been a pleasure hosting you. I would like to wish you a good evening and thank you for your time. And let's give it up for our debaters who have given us a lot of food for thought that we're going to think over over the next few days. Thank you so much, and it's been a pleasure having you. Have a good evening. Thank you.